Alright guys, welcome back to the second class in the series on apologetics, as second class applies. If you haven't seen the first video, I recommend you go and start there, or if you're actually with me at church taking this class in person, and this is just something you need to catch up on, well, then welcome, glad to have you here. So, where we left off last time was this idea that the world that we live in now doesn't assume God's existence, which was the case at the time that the Bible was written. And that's the reason that we don't see the apostles or the prophets, really anyone in the Bible, directly addressing the question of whether or not God exists at all, because it was just something that was an assumed truth in their world. But that's not the world that we live in today. So when we're talking about apologetics, we have a different starting point that we have to deal with now than that the early church had to deal with. And just as a reminder, when I say apologetics, I'm talking about that branch of Christian theology which seeks to provide a rational justification for the truth claims of the Christian faith. And we left off with, like I said, this worldview that the world doesn't always believe that God exists. So that's something that we would call naturalism. Now, there's two sides to naturalism, right? We have naturalism as a method, which would be the scientific method. And when we look at naturalism as a method, this is something that is limited to natural causes and explanations, and it investigates observable, testable, and repeatable events. Of course, there's the other side of naturalism, which is the philosophy. And the philosophy is one that says, well, nature is all that exists. Reality consists solely of physical matter and natural processes. It says that there are no supernatural beings, gods, or forces beyond the physical realm. And so we have two sides to this, and they both kind of get linked together intrinsically, whether that's appropriate or not. And this video is going to be a little bit shorter because I'm going to want you as a listener to pause the video at several times and think for a little bit before continuing the video. And this is one of those times. Go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to think through the question here. What are the strengths and uses of naturalism, so science, as a method? All right, I'll assume you've paused and thought this through. And before we kind of address that question, I want you to look at the other side of the coin. What are its limitations? Go ahead and pause the video again to think about that. Okay. So in class, we had this discussion, and we had a really good discussion on it. And we came to a few things. And first, I'd like to start off with the uses of naturalism and what it's good at. So to me, there's a lot of things that science is really, really good at. Honestly, anything that it's designed to do. So, testing things in the natural world, figuring out why does the apple fall, right? Where does disease come from? How does disease start? How does disease progress? If we look just at where we are in our world today, you're right now watching a video that I recorded an indiscriminate amount of time ago on a computer that takes signal from my voice and converts it into electronic bytes and stores that in a memory that it can then be uploaded so that you can see what I'm doing, you can hear what I'm saying, you can look at the screen that I recorded. There's a lot that science has done. And the technological advances we have between, the time of the Bible and today is enormous. I can't imagine that there'd be too many people walking around with Peter and Paul thinking, I wish that they could upload a YouTube video on what they're saying right now. That's science, that's technology. It's advanced us extremely far. We have better healthcare now. Our medicine is incredibly advanced compared to what it was even 100 years ago, not to mention 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago or the beginning of humanity, right? So medicine, technology, think about the cars that you drive, the airplanes that you fly on, air conditioning, that's a miracle in itself, right? But it's also technology. Science is really good at figuring out how the natural world works and what it does. And of course, in order to do that, it does have to limit itself, and that's where we kind of get into the limitations. It's right here in this definition that science, or methodological naturalism, is limited to natural causes and explanations. So that means that science itself can't tell us certain questions because they exist outside of its realm. For example, let's say that I walked into the kitchen and I saw that we have a tea kettle sitting on the stove and there's steam coming out of it. And I asked my wife, I said, hey, why is the tea kettle boiling? And she says, well, you see, Jace, the stove was turned on, and so that's causing an electrical current to go through the coils in the stove and cause those coils to heat up. And that heat is being transferred through the tea kettle into the water that's inside the tea kettle. And once it's done that, it's raised the temperature of that water such that it surpasses its boiling point. And once it does that, that water undergoes a phase transition from liquid to gas and juts out of the spout, and that's why you're hearing a whistle. And I'm like, okay, I mean, that's true, but it would be just as true and probably more appropriate to say, oh, well, I was going to make a cup of tea. Would you like some? There's a scientific explanation that was just given, and then there was the non-scientific explanation, what I might call the personal explanation. Both are true, and in this case, the personal explanation is more appropriate. And that's something that science isn't really able to address. Science can't tell me why the Mona Lisa is beautiful. I mean, there's certain mathematical properties that can attempt to tell me, but it can't actually definitely tell me with a formula, how do I make a performance that's as beautiful as Bach or Mozart? Beauty is one of those things that science isn't able to address because it's not investigatable, it's not repeatable. It's something that's subjective and viewed in the eyes of the beholder, right? And so that does give it a limit. Now, some people might say that that's not that bad of a limitation, which in a way I agree. I love science. I mean, that's what I do for a living, right? But it's important to know that science can't give us the answer to everything. And those questions are still part of reality. And so when we look at this idea, the philosophy side, so philosophical naturalism, when we look at that idea, we need to recognize that not everything that's a part of reality can be explained by science. And that's not to say anything bad about science, it's just that science isn't designed to do that. Where science can give us explanations, I think that we should use science to investigate those things, and I think that we should use science to advance our understanding. But I find it very foolish to limit ourselves to science as the end-all be-all explanatory power of the sum grand total of reality. And so this is where I want to kind of shift us, is using this idea of the philosophical naturalism as an extension of methodological naturalism, and using this as a test case to try and understand logic and argumentation. Now, when I say an argument, I don't mean me and you bickering back and forth on something we disagree on. I'm using this in the logical sense. So an argument is a structured set of statements where at least one statement provides support for another statement. Now, this right here is the foundation of all logical reasoning. It's used to establish a claim or persuade an audience. And this is something that you and I use every day, even if we don't think about it. We think, oh, that light's turning red, therefore the cars are going to stop, or therefore I should be stopping. And I mean, maybe that's a small example, but I think that the more you consider it, the more you'll realize how often you use this type of logic. The second piece here is a premise. I'm sorry, I went backwards. The second piece here is a premise, which is a statement that provides evidence or reasoning to support a conclusion. A premise can be facts, assumptions, or principles from which a logical result is drawn. Then you have a conclusion, the final statement that logically follows from the premises. It's the claim that an argument seeks to establish as true based on supporting evidence. Next we have a rebuttal. It's a response that challenges, weakens, or refutes an argument. It addresses weaknesses in either the premises or the reasoning of the original claim. And then finally we have a fallacy, which is a flaw or error in reasoning that weakens an argument. Fallacies can mislead or deceive by using incorrect logic or assumptions. And so we're going to put this into practice in just a moment, but I want to point something out. When you're making a rebuttal, there's two things you can be refuting. You can either say that I don't think this premise is true, or you can say the logic of your argument is untrue. In which case, even if the conclusion is true, the logic can still be untrue. Similarly, if the logic is correct, that doesn't mean the conclusion is true. There's two different things you can be rejecting. Now, a fallacy is something that happens on usually the presenter's side, so whoever's presenting the argument, which would be a flaw and error reasoning. Probably the most common fallacy that you've heard about would be what we'd call the straw man fallacy. And this is where you look at an opposing viewpoint and you create the weakest form of the argument that they have, and then you proceed to shred that argument. And in the end, you feel like you've won the debate, and you feel like you've defeated their argument. By presenting the weakest form of your opponent's argument, not only are you doing something that we would call a fallacy, I would argue that you're misleading or deceiving your audience, or even yourself. If we look at 2 Corinthians 4:2, it says, "But we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's consciousness in the sight of God." Now, to me, this falls under that category of renounced disgraceful and underhanded ways. When we're having discussions, whether it's in apologetics or really in any other aspect of life, we need to be very careful that what we are saying is true and that we're not committing any of these fallacies, especially a straw man fallacy, because I classify that as disgraceful and underhanded ways. And I think that if we truly believe that what the Bible says is reality, and if we truly believe in God, if we truly believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, then we have no need to resort to these underhanded ways. And when we do resort to these, whether it's intentionally or by accident, those things can be brought up to light, and it's going to make our position look worse. There's nothing that frustrates me more than seeing Christians giving bad arguments for Christianity, because all that does is confirm to the atheist or to the agnostic or to whatever non-Christian you have that they don't need to listen to our position because there's nothing to it, because all they've ever heard are fallacies. And so I just want us to keep that in mind moving forward. Now, back to the main point here. Let's look at how you would use this type of logical argumentation in practice. Premise 1, all humans need oxygen to live. Premise 2, Jace is a human. Conclusion, therefore Jace needs oxygen to live. Okay, so right here, what we're first going to do when we see an argument is we are going to pretend that all of the premises are true, go ahead and accept all the premises, assume that they are true, and then determine, does the conclusion logically follow from the premises? So in this case, premise 1 says, if A, then B. Premise 2 says A, and the conclusion is therefore B. So if A, then B, A, therefore B. This is a logical argument here. So now we would go and look at the premises themselves. All humans need oxygen to live. Well, in my experience, that's true. Premise 2, Jace is a human. I certainly hope so, otherwise I have a lot of questions for myself. Conclusion, therefore Jace needs oxygen to live. The conclusion also strikes me as true, because holding my breath is great, but only for a certain amount of time. So in this case, we would have an argument that has correct logic and it has true premises. Now let's look at the next step. Premise 1, all humans need oxygen to live. Premise 2, Jace needs oxygen to live. Conclusion, therefore Jace is a human. Now again, assume the conclusions are true and the premises are true, and let's look. Does the conclusion follow? In this case, I would say no, because I might be a dog, I could be a cat, I could even be a fire. The argument isn't logically sound, and it can be dismissed unless further supporting evidence is given. And then a third example, all birds can fly. Jace is a bird, therefore Jace can fly. Okay, now again, this is where we're going to have to really put into practice some powers of imagination. Assume the premises are true. Does the conclusion follow? Okay, if A, then B, A, therefore B. Okay, so this is a logical argument. However, that doesn't make it correct. It doesn't make it true. Not all birds can fly. Penguins cannot fly. Ostriches cannot fly. I am not a bird. Premise 2 is also false. So because premise 1 and premise 2 are false, even if only one of them were false, this argument wouldn't work. Okay, so this shows us that you can have correct logic but false premises and therefore get a false conclusion. You could also have incorrect premises but true logic, and you would still end up with a false conclusion. So what we need in a good argument is for both the logic and the premised statements to be true, or at least more likely true than their denial. So let's take this and apply this test to philosophical naturalism. So again, that's the philosophy that naturalistic events and naturalistic entities are all that exists. So philosophical naturalism says that it's the worldview that nature is all that exists, meaning reality consists solely of physical matter and natural processes. It asserts that there are no supernatural beings, gods, or forces beyond the physical universe. Let's break this down into an argument version. The reason that I want to do this is because I find it very helpful to take a statement, such as the defined philosophical naturalism here, and actually break it down into an argument to see if it's logical. Because just looking at this definition, I have a little bit of trouble telling if something is logical or sound argument or even good reasoning or not. Breaking it down into separate premises really helps us to understand what's being asserted and what's being argued here. And another thing I've done is something called steel manning this argument. So that's kind of the opposite of straw man, right? In a straw man argument, I would be giving you the weakest version of the argument. In a steel man argument, I've gone out of my way to try and come up with the strongest version of this argument that I can. And so that's what we're going to see here. Premise 1, science operates by seeking natural explanations. Yeah, that's true. Premise 2, methodological naturalism has consistently explained phenomena without invoking supernatural causes. Premise 3, no confirmed evidence of supernatural causation has been found through scientific investigation. Premise 4, if supernatural explanations are never required to understand reality, belief in them is less justified. Premise 5, the best explanation of reality is one that relies only on natural phenomena. Conclusion, therefore, naturalism provides the most justified framework for understanding reality. Okay. This is where I'm going to have you pause the video again, and I want you to first figure out, does this conclusion logically follow from premises 1 through 5 if you assume that premises 1 through 5 are true? Okay, assuming you've taken the time to think that through, I would say that if we accept premises 1 through 5, we have good reason to think that the conclusion would be true. Now let's ask the second question. Are the premises true? Are the premises logical? Go ahead and pause the video again, take a moment to think about this for yourself, and then we'll come back and discuss. Okay. I see a few problems here. The first thing is something we would call affirming the consequence. So we see science successfully explains phenomena using natural mechanisms. Oh, they're in premise 2. Okay, well, science only can use natural mechanisms. That's the point of science. That's its limitation. So the counterpoint here would be that science might be methodologically limited rather than providing a complete description of reality. So this is where I'd go back to my my tea kettle example. Just because it's true that the thermal energy of the stove is heating up the water and causing it to exceed its boiling point doesn't mean that that's the only explanation, even though it is a true explanation. There could be a better explanation, which is, well, I wanted a cup of tea. And so naturalistic explanations often fail to account for agency. We have this appeal to ignorance here. No confirmed evidence of supernatural causation has been found through scientific investigation. Well, absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Perhaps supernatural causation is outside the scope of scientific methodology, as we just said. For example, we have no evidence of life springing out of non-life from random chance, yet the people who affirm a naturalistic universe assume abiogenesis is the origin of life on Earth, thereby defeating the argument which they use to dismiss supernatural reality. Further, we have a false dilemma. If supernatural explanations are never required to understand reality, belief in them is less justified. Well, understanding the mechanism of an event doesn't imply that the event has no cause outside of its mechanism. Let's take an example from the Bible. Let's assume that, first off, let's assume that the Bible is historically accurate for this conversation, and let's assume that we are able to prove with 100% certainty that when Elijah challenged the Baal prophets on top Mount Carmel, lightning struck his sacrifice and lit the altar on fire. Now, that's a fully naturalistic explanation, but would that nullify the claim that God lit the altar on fire? You know, methodological naturalism can provide a mechanism, but a mechanism can say nothing of the presence or absence of willful causation. Sometimes it can give us hints. For example, in the claim in that situation with Elijah, even though I knew the naturalistic explanation for how that fire got there, I would still look around and be like, you know, it's really unlikely that the moment a prophet, or at least a proclaimed prophet, pointed at an altar and said, my God's going to light that on fire, and then boom, lightning struck, that feels really unlikely to have happened by random chance. Maybe there was causation there. But at the same time, naturalism can't explain yes or no on that causation. That's something that we're going to have to go to philosophy and logic to address. Further, we have the best explanation of reality is one that relies only on natural phenomena. Okay, the argument assumes its conclusion, which is that only natural causes exist, within the premise by excluding supernatural explanations at the outset. So the absence of supernatural necessity doesn't logically entail that reality is only natural. It simply suggests that science functions without supernatural assumptions. So if I look around my room right now, and I can only see the visible spectrum of light, I can't assume that other electromagnetic radiation is absent from the room. I'm just relying on the wrong tools, my eyes, to measure it. So I can't see UV radiation. I can't see gamma rays, which I hope aren't in my room right now. And so in the same way, science is not the right tool to address the question of supernatural phenomena because, as the definition of science says, it's limited to naturalistic and explanations and causes. Let's look at the counter-argument here to philosophical naturalism. Again, I tried to give as strong of an argument as I could. Premise 1. If philosophical naturalism is true, then no non-naturalistic entities exist. Premise 2. Numbers, logic, objective morals, consciousness, and God are non-naturalistic entities. Premise 3. Numbers, logic, objective morals, consciousness, and God exist. Conclusion. Therefore, philosophical naturalism is not true. Okay, again, let's grant the premises. Does the conclusion logically follow from the premises? Yes, if there are non-naturalistic entities which exist, as premise 1, 2, and 3 say, then philosophical naturalism can't be true from premise 1. So, if somebody's going to object to this argument, then they would need to object to the premises themselves. Most often, you're going to find somebody objecting to a combination of premise 2 and 3. So typically, the argument would be that numbers and logic are descriptions of reality, but are still naturalistic, that objective morals are what we would call socio-biological constructs. So the idea would be that, on atheism at least, well, objective morals are socially advantageous for the survival of our species, and therefore they evolved amongst humanity as humanity arose as its own distinct species with its own culture. And then consciousness would be just a bundle of neurons in your head firing and creating these thoughts that you're having. So that would be, again, naturalistic. Typically, they would argue that God is non-naturalistic, but God doesn't exist. So that's the argument that you're going to see against this right here. The nice thing is, if we can show that even one of these objects, or another object that I haven't listed here, is a existing non-naturalistic entity, then we've already shown that philosophical naturalism is false. And I think there's very good reason to believe that all of these things that I've listed, numbers, logic, objective morals, and consciousness and God, are existent non-naturalistic entities. Further, if you're going to have a discussion with somebody about philosophical naturalism, and we take this argument, then they can't argue that God doesn't exist because philosophical naturalism is true. Otherwise, they would be invoking a line of circular reasoning. And so then, even if they are objecting to this, you may be able to get a really good conversation with the person you're having a discussion with, the skeptic, about the existence of God, where they can't just dismiss God's existence outright, or they'd be guilty of circular logic. So, I want us to look at this video from a guy that's on YouTube, very popular, named Alex O'Connor. He is an atheist, but I also find him to be an extremely intellectually honest person. He is not outright dismissive or antagonistic towards people of faith just because he doesn't have that faith. He is just a philosopher and is actively seeking the truth. And I think you'll be interested in his perspective on the relationship between science and what questions it can and can't answer.
And the mistake that makes, this is crucial to me, is thinking that scientific laws somehow explain the universe instead of just describing them. It would be as though we discovered a book of Shakespeare's sonnets and said, how did that get there? And we say, I don't know. And I start studying it. And I say, well, look, I've just discovered it follows this rhythm. Da, 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 da. And I'm going to call that iambic pentameter, the law of iambic pentameter. And I've also discovered this law that at the end of a sentence there's usually a little dot. That's the law of punctuation, and how after that there are two types of letters and the big letter comes next. All these laws that I'm discovering. And someone says, well, where did the book come from? And you say, well, I mean, I don't know. We haven't answered that yet. But look at how much progress we've made in uncovering the laws of literacy. Surely one day this will come to explain the origins of the literary laws themselves and the origin of the book. It's a category error. It's a total mistake.
That could almost come from a Christian trying to put science in its box. We've chosen a very forgiving atheist on this.
An atheist who practically sounds like he believes in God at this point.
I've got to ask, do you feel like there is any chance if we get you back in 10 years' time, you'd have a different answer to that question?
Yeah, God willing.
Okay. So what Alex was getting at there is that when we are doing science, what we're doing is describing reality. We're describing why the apple falls. We're describing why the stars are combusting. We're describing why one cell divides into another cell. We're describing how animals reproduce. But all we're doing is describing things. We can't assume that our description of reality can ever provide us an explanation for the existence of that reality itself. And so in the next class that I'm going to do, we're going to be discussing that very question of why does anything exist at all? And I think that's a question that science can't explain. The existence of the universe can't be from within the universe. And so I'll leave you with that to chew on. And again, I brought these up last time, but I just want you to think about these questions. What are some of the best arguments that you've heard for Christianity? And what are some of the strongest objections you've heard to Christianity? And that's where we'll pick up next time. Thanks.